Everybody's heard about the bird. Bird, bird, bird. The bird's a winner. Well, a bird, bird, bird. Bird is a winner. Well, a bird, bird, bird. Well, a bird is a winner. Well, a bird, bird, bird. The bird's a winner. Well, a bird, bird, bird. Well, a bird is a winner. Well, a bird, bird. The bird's a winner. Well, don't you know about the bird? Well, everybody knows that the bird is a winner. Well, a bird.
Hello, my name is Robert Martin. I'm one of the MennoNerds. I blog at Abnormal Anabaptist. And today, I welcome to my laptop, to my little corner of the world here, Shirley Showalter, author of Blush, A Mennonite Girl Meets a Glittering World. This is going to be a great conversation. We're going to be talking about what it means to be a woman growing up in the Mennonite church, about the different changes that went on in those years of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, being a woman in the Mennonite church, and just the different things about what it means to be an author, telling stories, and life in general. So step back, sit back, enjoy, and here we go.
What I wanted to talk about with you is basically just kind of on the same lines as your book, Blush. Just talk about you and your life, what it was like growing up and everything like that. So you and I both grew up as Mennonites. I grew up in Morgansville, Maryland, Hagerstown area. Grew up with a relatively conservative Mennonite congregation, and obviously you grew up fairly conservative Mennonite yourself. So what was it like for you growing up as a Mennonite in your context where you lived?
Well, I was born in 1948, and that meant that the Mennonite world of Lancaster Conference at the time was one in which women wore coverings and cape dresses, and there was a lot more variation in the part of what men wore, but the emphasis in the church was on separation from the world and on visible means of separating. So the interesting thing to me about reflecting on my childhood was that for the first 6 years of my life, I didn't even think about being Mennonite at all. I was a fish. I was in the sea of Mennonites, and they seemed altogether normal to me, and my life seemed normal. So I had no sense of real alienation or even separation. The separating that was going on was happening in the world outside my sphere while I was growing up on the farm and going to Sunday school and primarily relating to my own family. That changed when I went to public school, and for the first time I became aware of this difference between my family and other families, between what the kids on the playground were talking about, which was very television focused, and
Right.
what the other girls were wearing and doing, all the way from brownies and jewelry and having a lot of pop culture toys, and even back then there were brands that were beginning, and the kids were starting Roy Rogers lunch buckets and things like that. So I
Gotcha. So you were at school before your public school. Was that Hinkletown Mennonite? I think I remember reading that somewhere before.
No, I did not go to a Mennonite school. I went to Fairland Elementary School, and if I had gone to Mennonite schools the whole way through, I don't think I would have been particularly. I don't think I would have felt the same kind of conflict that I felt going to a public school. But I went to Mannheim Central's Fairland Elementary School for my first 6 years, and then we moved, and I came to Warwick High School and Warwick Middle School, first of all, and then Warwick High School, and never went to Hinkletown, never went to Lancaster Mennonite. And the kids who did go there, whether they were more or less conservative at school than they were at home or in their own church, they had uniformity among all of their peers. And that was very different in a public high school where there were maybe, out of a class of 144, I think maybe 5 or 6 Mennonite students.
Okay. Which is, yeah, okay, that would probably be about right. Public school in that day and age, the Mennonites stayed in their own schools, and public school they kept to themselves. Yeah, I grew up going to public school my whole life as well. Did not do Mennonite schools or anything. My younger brother did LMH when we moved up to Lancaster County, and I just in that era, that was like early '90s. I don't think there was a whole lot of difference between the kids going to LMH and the kids going to public schools at that time either.
One of the things that I learned, when you sit down to reflect on your own life and to choose, I chose childhood as the time I was going to focus on, you look at it through a different kind of lens. Your experience looks different to you than when you lived it in the first place. And this is especially true since my academic field is American Studies, and analyzing a culture has been of interest to me ever since I went to graduate school. And so I could now turn my attention on my own culture in my own era. And one of the things that was so clear is that I just happened to have been born in the era when, as I became a teenager, the church was just on the cusp of change.
Gotcha.
So that with regard especially to women and their dress, because women were the ones who were the markers of difference, much more than men. And the expectation that from sermons and from your family was that as a Mennonite woman, you would follow 1 Corinthians 11. You would cover your hair. You would do it in the manner prescribed by the Mennonite Church. I'm 7 years older than my next younger sister. By the time she came along, it was no longer expected that the minute you stood in a revival meeting or otherwise indicated that you wanted to join the church, that you needed to wear a covering right away and that you needed to wear it all the time. So I was born in this little slice of time of the end of the 40s and right into 1966, which is when I graduated from high school, where almost all Mennonite girls of that time were wearing coverings all the time. 7 years later, at least in our church, it was no longer necessary, and you wore a covering, but you wore it to church only, and your hair was not long and pulled back into a bob. And so that was a significant change. The whole period of distinctive dress that had come in at the late 19th century and then continued right up until the time I graduated from high school. And just about that time, we were ready to make a significant change that's going to affect young girls of the future and young boys too, but much more young girls.
I would say that if I'm dating things correctly, your high school graduation was around the time that my mother graduated from EMC. So just thinking back from some of the pictures that I have of her, some of the memories I have of her, she was also coming up in that same time period of a change in dress. I remember, I don't remember exactly when it was, but I do remember that there was a time when I noticed that my mom was not wearing the covering even in the church anymore, which that was kind of scandalous almost, even in the 80s, that you're at church and you're a woman, you're not covering your head. That was a bit of a push, and very different time period. It sounds like it was, from listening to you and just again memories of my mother, very turbulent time period for the church and that whole in the cultural identity that comes from the dress itself.
Yes, it was a very turbulent time period. One of the things I talk about in Blush is there's a whole chapter devoted to our conflict as a congregation with our bishop, and also my personal confrontation with him as a 17-year-old. That was a time, I've never been in a church where there was more tension, so that when you walked in the church doors, it was thick with anxiety. People trying to figure out the bishop that had been our bishop for many years, fit our minister and our congregation very well, but in the early to mid-1960s, we had a change of bishop, and the new bishop came from a much more conservative background, and he was trying to bring this whole congregation with him. We didn't know him very well, and we had been very close-knit around our own good relationship with the leadership of the church until he came along. And then I remember my father standing in the doorway between the dining room and the kitchen in our home saying, my father went to this church and my father's father went to this church, and I really love this church and I don't want to leave it, but I don't think I can stay in it anymore. And
yeah.
to hear him say that was cataclysmic for the identity of our family and our church. As it turned out, the bishop was part of the group that split into the Eastern District, and that he left us rather than our church leaving him.
Gotcha.
But it was a time of very great change. Probably not too different from today. The issues are different, but but that sense of the fragility of the community was there.
It seems like the community back then and even today is defined less about gathering around a particular idea and more about living within a particular set of boundaries and rules. Does that sound about right to you as well?
I think so. It certainly seems that way, but to them, I'm not sure. I think it probably would go back to boundaries and rules, but also a certain way of reading the Bible. That, as all literal readings of the Bible are, it was selective in which passages seemed to hold the most weight, but it wasn't just authority and power and boundaries. It was also a sense of this is what it means to be a Christian, and especially to be a Mennonite Christian. And it's that way because of the Bible. And so it was it was a kind of biblical literalism that undergirded the strong sense of boundaries.
Right. Just because it's just the way my brain works. Just thinking about biblical literalism and the Anabaptist way of thinking about things, Mennonites being one of the larger Anabaptist denominations in the world. Why do you think that's the case? Why do you think that many, especially when you're getting into the more conservative Mennonite groups, that selective biblical literalism comes out quite so strongly? I mean, in your generation, it was dress and women's roles and everything, and we still have a little bit of that residual now, but now in this generation we're dealing with human sexuality and those issues and those conversations. How does that happen in an Anabaptist environment that seems more that is, at least by our general ideals, is more focused on following Jesus than it is about finding the particular literal translations of Scripture?
Yeah.
I know that.
And I think just as we take Jesus seriously and literally,
Mm-hmm.
now I remember explaining to students at Gordon College why Mennonites are pacifists, and I simply said that we believe that when Jesus said love your enemies, he actually meant that.
Yeah.
And so, that there isn't a way to explain that away, that is not only his words come to us through the Bible, but it's normative and it is supported by the Holy Spirit, and it is countercultural, but it is what we're called to do. And
I think it plays out a little bit more also that not only did he say it, but he lived it. Whereas some of the other things that we have a tendency to take literal, there's written words, but we don't actually have quite so clear an example of someone living it out that way.
yes, and I think that's one of the reasons why it changed. Those of us who have changed have a hierarchy of verses, and Jesus' words in the Scripture. The red letter Christians have privileged the words of Jesus, and those who are more focused on, say, the role of the church itself would look to the epistles and to the other parts of the New Testament that describe relationship between the church and the world, and that's where you get that emphasis, even though you wouldn't find in the life and teachings of Jesus, you don't find examples of what became kind of solidified. You do in the rest of the New Testament find evidence from the importance of if you take what Paul was saying to the Corinthians and to the other members of the early church, and you make that as normative for today as Jesus' words are in the Gospels, that's how you get a similar approach to Scripture, but emphasizing different parts of it. You get Mennonites in one camp choosing to focus on Pauline writings, and in another camp focusing on the words of Jesus. Both of them with origins in the words of Jesus, and I would like to think that there is a commonality among all Mennonites, but and that they aren't necessarily totally different in their biblical interpretation. Now, I'm not a theologian, and I don't pretend.
I actually have some friends who'd probably argue that you are a theologian, that you may not do it the way some folks do it, but if you're applying God to regular life, that's a theologian. So, I
think we're all called to be practical theologians, and I hope that I am one as well.
Yeah. So, all right, let's backtrack a little bit here. Another story from my mother's life. Again, growing up very much in your generation and dealing with those things. Something that was expressed to me. Oh shoot, when was it? It wasn't that long after she died that my dad relayed this story. That again, a teenager sitting in the pews of the church, you sometimes are completely oblivious to the stuff going on around you. My mother was at one point in time leading the hymns at our home church. So she was up there in front on the dais leading the hymns, and then suddenly she wasn't. And after the fact, I found out that it was because, well, there were people within our home congregation that had a problem with not just a woman leading the hymns, but the fact that she was up front over the congregation and being in a position of, even just with hymns, a position of authority over the congregation.
Mm-hmm.
And that was for me in retrospect. What was that?
Were all hymns led from that same elevated position, or did she choose to go up there?
All hymns were led from that position.
Pardon?
All hymns were led from that elevated position.
Okay. So nobody thought about it until a woman gets into that elevated position.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, just thinking about, again, just little bits of your biography. You were president of a college for a time. What challenges did you face being a woman? I mean, you talk about in your book about being a child growing up through that era of the changing of dress and the changing of clothes. What challenges did you face being a woman growing up through college and through your later careers, and other choices you made in your life in Mennonite culture and the Mennonite denomination?
Yeah. Well, certainly there were many expectations of limits for women, just as there were boundaries around what Mennonites should and should not be doing. So you kind of double the boundaries if you're a woman growing up as a Mennonite. And that was a reality that I lived with. But I also felt a great deal of support and affirmation. And as, again, those lenses you look at as you go back and examine your own childhood, it's very clear that there were people who were kind of in my corner and encouraging me and seeing leadership gifts in me. From my very own family to my Sunday school teachers and my teachers at school, so that for as many times as I stubbed my toes against barriers for women, there were many other times when someone kind of gently tapped me on the shoulder, sometimes to dampen my enthusiasm a little bit, because showing proper reserve was an important part of being a good Mennonite girl, and I wasn't always as reserved as I was supposed to be. But even when I was being corrected, it felt like this is for your own good. Mm-hmm. This is to help you navigate so that you can shine, so that you can step forward into the light as you feel led. And so I can truly say that I experienced limits set for women in the society and in the Mennonite church. But I can also say there were ameliorating circumstances, shall we say, where I was blessed to have a great deal of love and support, and people saying to me, you know, in one way or the other, you are a leader, and you are meant to be a leader, and we approve of you as a leader. So I can give you stories on both sides. Right.
It sounds like there would probably be some confusion and conflict. You're getting mixed messages in that era, that some people are telling you, yes, you can be a leader, you have everything it takes to be a leader, whereas you got just equally the number of people saying, no, you shouldn't be leading, you should be kind of stepping aside and letting other people do that work. How did you deal with handling those kinds of mixed messages from the two different camps? How did you process that?
Well, I sought mentors and found them. I found them in feminist writings, in feminist theological writings, and in the writings of the history of women, which is a course that I taught at Goshen College and at the University of Texas. where I taught the first women's studies course at the university. And by finding, actually biography has been really important to me all my life. I love studying history by studying other people's lives and seeing the influence of the major ideas of their times and of the cultural trends and the cultural expectations around them, so that I could see how other people lived with the mixed messages of their times. And I did not have a lot of mentors in leadership in the church, because there were, at the same time I was being asked to do more leadership things within higher education, women were just at that same time becoming ordained for the first time. And so, again, the timing is coincidental or serendipitous, whichever way you want to look at it, so that I didn't have to break out of the pack alone as a woman. I had others who were also feeling called, stepping forward, and I have always had good, strong women friends who have supported me and offered guidance, encouragement along the way. I didn't have a lot of people, certainly Lee Snyder and I were the only Mennonite women presidents until I guess Sarah Wanger-Shank now at AMBS is the only other one since then. So there haven't been a lot, and Lee and I were kind of at the same time, but I really appreciated the fact that I could talk with Lee as another woman president, and that I had other women president friends that I met at the Harvard School for New Presidents when I first became a college president. So I had friends both inside and outside the Mennonite Church as I was asked to take that position, and they were extremely helpful to me.
Just out of curiosity, did you know my mother? I'm just trying to remember if there's any connections there, because I know she was back and forth from Elkhart and Goshen and all over the place all the time. Yeah, in the 90s and the early 2000s.
Well, no.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't know if they. I know Mom knew so many people and talked to so many people. I could never keep track of her. She was never home. She was always out traveling somewhere. So which was interesting. It was very interesting in her later life, all the involvement that she was in contrast to the stuff that she had when I was younger and growing up. That there was this radical shift in her life. That at one point in time she was kind of kept, quote unquote, in her place, but then in her later years it just was like all of a sudden an explosion. She was all over the place and anything. Did you experience something like that as well? That there was a time period where you were kind of boxed in, and then all of a sudden there was a lot of opportunity, or was it a little bit more gradual for you than that?
I think it was a little more gradual than that, and in academics probably a little different from the church, because when my husband Stuart and I arrived at Goshen College in 1976, there had been 3 other young couples hired the same year. And all of us were either had our PhDs or we were in the process of finishing our PhD work. And this was a real, the change. Mm-hmm. But it was a change at the beginning of our career, not in the middle of our career. So my son, for example, would probably have seen my life as an academic kind of unfolding, more or less evolving or gradually taking on more and more leadership as I grew into both teaching and administrative roles.
Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't as much of a need for someone in authority to bless that as there would be if you were a minister.
Right. About your book, you may have already touched on this a little bit in our discussions. Why did you write Blush? What was your purpose and motivation to write Blush?
Well, I wanted to tell a story about Mennonite life from the perspective of a Mennonite person. There's so much in the culture right now that romanticizes both Amish and Mennonites, and there's a lot of fiction that is written by people who are not Mennonite or not Amish, and I thought it was fitting that I reflected on my own life for many of the same reasons that other people write memoir. They want to record what's been important to them, what they care about, what they value, pass that on, as both as a gift, as it was given to me, to us, to them, but also as a way of exploring and discovering what has been most important. So I've actually talked about 3 or 4 different motives or things that came along. My desire to write a memoir actually evolved, like most of the rest of my life, starting with the invitation to write short memoir essays, starting with the year I was at Valparaiso University as a senior fellow, when I was in charge of mentoring young PhDs and chose the theme of spiritual autobiography as the theme for the year. And during that year, it was amazing to see what happened as people became more vulnerable, told stories closer and closer to their own hearts and fears, and how we all held those stories as sacred trusts. And I really believe that storytelling from our own lives is one of the most important spiritual tasks of our lives. That we are built out of stories, we are built to tell stories, and we are built to connect our stories to each other. And when we have a healthy church, that's exactly what we've done. And when we have conflict and we actually take the time to listen to other people's stories, we may still disagree with where they are in a particular position, but boy, it makes a huge difference as to whether we understand them as fellow human beings or not. And it may just give us the space to live in ambiguity for a while because we've seen the face of God in that other person. And so I see memoir as being about a whole lot more than just relaying factual information from one generation to the next. It's part of a process that I consider holy, that I've experienced myself and would like to pass on to other people.
I don't think it's entirely unusual that most of the Bible is written in story form itself. That if God wanted to give us a book of rules, He would have given us the Quran right up front. But He gave us a bunch of stories of a bunch of really messed up individuals. I mean, you read the stories of David, and even Elijah and Elisha didn't have it all together all the time. And the hero Noah, who saved the world on his little ark, gets drunk and naked in his tent later on. I mean, come on. These are stories of really strange and weird people, but somehow they have spiritual significance. So I think that's a very interesting reason for memoir as a literary form to interact with story, to share story with each other,
Yes.
and learn who the people are, not just the facts of the situation, but actually know the person.
Right. I believe that completely. And for example, when we know what music has touched the soul of another person, and we listen to that music after we've heard their story about what this music has done for them, what it means, perhaps how it's tied up with family members or someone they've loved, and then all of a sudden music that you think you hate sounds different in your ears, and you hear it and you feel it altogether differently.
Mm-hmm.
And that same thing happens in every other area of life where we have potential to misunderstand each other, but story can break through and help us empathize and identify with others.
Yeah.
I think we need it now more than ever.
I think especially as the culture around us shifts to being very much more a post-Christian, postmodern culture. It's not quite so much the rational, logical arguments about things, but it becomes a lot. There's a lot of ambiguity in it, just generally speaking, in the feel of American society now. People they may say they're certain, but there's always a nagging doubt behind them, it seems. And I think a theology of story is going to help out a lot with that as we start connecting more to who people are and less on the facts of the matters. I think that's really going to be an important point to move forward on.
Yeah, and I think within churches it's very important too. I spoke at University Mennonite Church in College Station on Sunday, and we had a really good dialogue about the role of story in helping in a church where people are coming from a distance to really connect with each other. Story can help solidify a group even when it's geographically dispersed and culturally more diverse than most of us grew up with in our own childhoods.
Yeah.
There was a lot of excitement about that.
Yep. What was the best reaction and worst reactions you received around your book? Because I imagine sharing the secrets of Mennonite life, sometimes we may have gotten some different reactions depending upon who read it and when they read it. So give me your best reaction and worst reaction you received to your book.
Well, that's an interesting question. I think one of my favorite reactions came from my niece, who is 12 years old, or was 12 years old when she reviewed my book.
Okay.
And I put her review up on my blog and did a little interview with her. And
I think I remember seeing that.
It was just delightful. And I had hoped that young people could read the book and identify with the character and also find it interesting, even though it's quite different from the way she's growing up. And that happened. So I really enjoyed her reactions. They were so honest and straightforward. And I felt affirmed by her. When she said that she really enjoyed especially the parts where I was coming into her age period in time, and that she couldn't put the book down and wanted to keep on reading it. That was a lot of fun. But what was even more fun, and here's the point again, was that we told each other stories, stories that weren't in the book. As I went through my interview with her, we ended up sharing stories back and forth, even ones that she hadn't known, and certainly ones I didn't know about her. So I got to know her better because of the book. And I think that's one of the best things that any book can do for an author, is to deepen relationships with people you already love and care about, in her case, but also with many other strangers. And I'd have, in that same category of best reactions, of when you open up your email in the morning and someone pours their heart out about their own story because of the sense that they would have an empathic ear of having met you on the page. That's always really fun. I can't think of any negative responses that I feared for some negative responses when I was about to, hit publish. There were times
hit that send button to send it off to the publisher, saying, "Here it is, editors." Yeah.
Yeah. There were times that I had anxieties about, especially about people who are named in the book, but I did not give them prior veto power over the story. You always worry about that, but people have been very generous with me, and I counted on the fact that I had to get very clear in my own mind what my motive was and my intention. And I knew that I had no intention to harm or hurt anyone. I did feel it was necessary to tell the truth about some conflicts in our family, because I couldn't tell my story without telling the truth about that. But I waited long enough so that I felt that I had done a lot of healing work myself, and that I could see a much larger perspective on conflict than I might have been able to do certainly in my 30s, but also in my 40s and 50s. That it took me quite a while to start to really see my grandfather's perspective, for example, because my father was always telling me about how wrong it was that he was treated a certain way. And I always believed him and took his side of the story until I got older and started to look at it from more perspectives. And
Yeah, you had the perspective of years behind you to be able to say.
Yes. Yeah. And so I counted on my own sense of trust in what I was trying to do, and in the care that I took with the language, so that I knew that did not guarantee that someone would not be angry or hurt when they read my book. And maybe some people have been, but they haven't talked to me about it. And if so, what that says to me is that they themselves may be going through a process of enlarging their perspectives, and that we have to give each other time to do that. But the people I worried most about were my father's siblings. My grandfather no longer lives, and my grandmother no longer lives, so when I tell those stories, I'm not encroaching on a living person's sense of identity. But there are always children, and when there's sibling relationships, you have the potential to see very different stories growing up in the same family. But I've gotten such good support from my family all the way around that I don't have those same anxieties anymore. and I appreciate the fact that I've been given the opportunity to tell a story about something that is a very frequent story among Mennonites, which is hurt feelings over how to dispose of land. So you have a combination of land and blood, and you've got some of the most primal human emotions that exist. And that story affected my family, and I know that it has affected hundreds, if not thousands, of other Mennonite families.
Yep. All right. We're going to do two more questions to kind of wrap it up here. Just as some final wrap-up questions. First one is, considering your extensive history with the Mennonite Church from the 40s all the way up to today, and the broader conversation among Christian churches in the United States and in the Western world, what are the treasures and contributions that Mennonites have to offer to that broader conversation?
Well, I think there are many. And I actually asked that very question in this book. When I was writing it, I was in Brooklyn, New York. And I was in a writer's group. We called ourselves the Manhattan Memoir Posse.
Okay.
And most of the people in the group were either Jewish or agnostics, maybe one Buddhist. And so religion in that group was almost an alien thing. And to go to a religion as thick as Mennonites, to use Clifford Gertz's term,
right.
It was really quite interesting to them, and did require some explanation. And so I asked, do you think, even though this is a story about growing up Mennonite and which ends when I could leave for college, that I should write an epilogue called Why I Am Still a Mennonite? And they were all supportive of that and wanted to know the answer to that question. And so I have a 2-page answer in here that I won't read, and I won't...
no spoilers.
Pardon?
No spoilers. We got to read the book.
Spoilers. But what it is a series of concrete images and memories of the things that have pulled me to the church, even in times of change and of lack of unity. And those things have to do with like hearing, walking down a path in West Africa where we were leading a group of international service learning students, but going to meet with some MCCers and hearing, I think it was For God So Loved Us, being sung in Africa by these MCCers, it just was the deepest kind of calling, and I felt that my ancestors were calling me down that path. And I've had experiences like that many times in my life. Some of them were within my family, my friends, and my family being formed around the church, but not always. But also, I am always moved by things like in the last election when we were invited as congregations to have communion services and to pass the peace of Christ, knowing that the person in your group probably voted to cancel out your vote. But you still come to the altar, you still hold your belief in Christ and in the love of your community above your own political affiliations and perspectives. Those are the kinds of things that have kept me in the church. In the end, they go back to Jesus and to peace, and to saying that someone has to stop the cycle of violence, and we are called to be those people. And I never know for sure that I would have the courage to lay down my life for the sake of peace and for others. But I do know one thing, that if I am in the situation of being challenged, I have stories that were told to me of others who did it.
Right.
And I will remember those stories, and I will try under those circumstances to keep the chain of connection to Christ alive through witness for peace.
Yep. Any last comments you want to give to anybody who's watching? Just you want to wrap up what you're about, what the book's about, the stuff that we talked about. You know, if there's a final thought that you want to leave everybody with.
Just that this is an exciting time in which to live, and that the process of reviewing your own life can be one of great spiritual growth. So I encourage everyone to do that. And I'm very glad that I've been given the gift of a Mennonite community around which to follow Jesus, and that that's what it's all about.
All right. Well, thank you, Shirley. And those of you who are watching, I'm going to be doing it. I'm going to go out and buy Shirley's book. I've got a 13-year-old daughter, an 11-year-old daughter, and a wife upstairs that I'm sure would greatly appreciate hearing the stories of a woman growing up as a Mennonite. So thank you, Shirley, for taking your time to talk with me this evening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Robert.
All right. Have a good night.
Good night.